The boy just wanted to learn how to paint, until he showed a canvas the artist never thought he'd see again. The park always seemed the same: tall trees, old wooden benches, peaceful shadows, and the distant sound of children playing. For someone passing by distractedly, nothing stood out. But for Thomas, that space was his refuge. Every day he arrived early, carrying his easel, his paints, worn-out brushes, and the quiet loneliness that had followed him for years. He always chose the same spot, beneath the shade of a fig tree, near a small dirt trail that few dared to walk. Thomas was 38, but his eyes carried decades of exhaustion. He was a painter who, in earlier times, had exhibited in small galleries, taught workshops for young people, and dreamed of a life surrounded by color. But the years hadn't been kind. After his separation, and the sudden disappearance of the woman he lived with along with the son they had together, he had withdrawn from the world. He tried to move on, searched for answers, but found no leads, no messages, no news. She had simply vanished. And with her, she took the only part of him he truly loved. Since then, he had stopped painting for others. He no longer sold his work, no longer participated in exhibitions, no longer taught. All that remained was the habit of painting for himself, in the park, in silence. There, colors still made some kind of sense. It was how he stayed sane. One morning, as he prepared his paints, he noticed something different. A boy was watching him from a distance. At first, Thomas thought it was just passing curiosity, a child fascinated by someone painting, as occasionally happened. But the next day, the boy was there again, and the day after that, and again, always at the same time, always sitting on the same concrete bench, feet swinging in the air, eyes focused. He was a skinny boy with light brown hair and bright, curious eyes, about 10 years old, dressed simply, always carrying a sketchbook. He never said a word. He just watched. Thomas tried to ignore it, but the boy's steady presence began to disturb him. Not because it was annoying, but because it stirred something he'd fought to bury. There was something familiar about the boy, something in the way he furrowed his brow when Thomas picked a different color, or the way he tilted his head, curious about the brushstrokes. It was as if Thomas saw a mirror of his younger self, or maybe a reflection of the son he had lost. On the fourth day, the boy approached. With confident steps, he walked up to the easel, looked at the unfinished painting, and smiled. "You paint really well," he said casually. "Can I learn?" Thomas was caught off guard. It had been a long time since someone spoke to him with such simplicity, and even longer since he'd heard that phrase, "Can I learn?" The same question he used to hear so often as an art teacher. "How old are you?" he asked, his voice quieter than he expected. 10. Thomas swallowed hard. 10. The same age his son would be today. It had been 8 years since the woman disappeared with the child. His heart raced for a moment, but he tried not to show it. "Do you like to draw?" he continued. The boy opened his sketchbook and showed some drawings. They were simple: trees, little houses, smiling figures. But there was something in the lines, a firmness, a real attempt to capture the world around him. It caught Thomas's attention. "I like it. I do it when I'm alone." "You come here often?" "Almost every day. My mom works. I wait here for her to pick me up." Thomas nodded silently. For a moment he felt the urge to ask the mother's name, but he held back. It was too soon. And deep down, he was afraid of the answer. "Want to try painting today?" he asked, pointing to one of the brushes. The boy's eyes lit up. "Really, I can?" "Sure, just don't ruin my paints," Thomas replied with a faint smile. "The first in a long time." The boy took the brush carefully, like he was holding treasure. Thomas handed him a sheet of paper and showed him how to dip the tip in paint. For several minutes they stood side by side, sharing silence, color, and discovery. The boy laughed when he made a mistake with a brushstroke, and Thomas, almost without realizing it, laughed too. That morning was different. For the first time in years, Thomas didn't paint a thing, but he left the park with something new, a feeling he barely remembered how to name. On the way home, easel over his shoulder and thoughts scattered, he found himself quietly murmuring, 10 years old. Was it just a coincidence? He wanted to believe it was, but something inside him whispered otherwise. The days that followed settled into a quietly enchanting rhythm. Always at the same time, the boy would show up at the park with his sketchbook tucked under his arm and that same curious look, as if he could see more than he let on. Thomas no longer found his presence strange. On the contrary, he had begun to expect it. As he set up his easel, laid out his paints on the bench, and adjusted the brush between his fingers, he felt something inside him beginning to shift. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, like the way morning light filters through autumn leaves. But it was real. The boy's presence was filling a space in him that he hadn't even known was empty. "Can I try again today?" the boy asked, eyes glowing. "Of course," Thomas replied, handing him a blank sheet and a brush. "Yesterday, my mom liked what I painted. She said it looked expressive," the boy said proudly. "I don't really know what that means, but I think it's good, right?" Thomas chuckled softly. "It's great. It means you put feeling into what you did, and that's what really matters." They sat side by side. While the boy painted with focus, Thomas watched him. The brushstrokes were still childlike, but there was something there, a natural ease, a quiet determination, that reminded Thomas of himself as a child. He had started the same way, drawing with charcoal on scrap wood in his grandmother's backyard. "And your dad? Does he paint too?" Thomas asked, trying to sound casual. The boy hesitated for a moment. "I don't know my dad." The words hung heavy in the air. Thomas nodded gently, saying nothing. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was shared, respectful, as if both of them understood that some answers don't need to be spoken aloud. "But my mom has an old painting at home," the boy continued after a few minutes. "It's hanging on the living room wall. She said it's by an artist she knew a long time ago." Thomas looked up slowly. "Did she say the artist's name?" "She did. But I think I forgot. I just remember the signature is kind of hard to read. I can take a picture and show you if you want." Thomas's heart skipped. "Maybe. If you'd like to," he replied, trying to mask the sudden tension in his voice. "Okay, I'll bring it tomorrow," the boy said, excited. Thomas tried to remain composed, but the weight of possibility began to settle deep in his soul. A painting. Old. Kept by the mother. An artist she once knew. It all echoed with a chilling familiarity. It can't be, he thought. Or could it? The boy got up to rinse his brush in a cup of water. Thomas watched him from afar. The way he held the brush, his focused posture, the slight bite on his lower lip when he made a mistake. It was like watching a forgotten reflection, a living memory of who he once was and who he might have become. "Hey," the boy called out, returning with the dripping brush. "Do you think I could really be a painter someday?" "You already are," Thomas replied sincerely. "A good painter starts with curiosity." The boy smiled, and in that smile, Thomas saw something he couldn't ignore. A familiar light, a tenderness he recognized but couldn't place. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. Sitting at the edge of his bed, he held one of the oldest paintings he had ever made. A small portrait of a woman holding a baby. It had been a gift. One of the last he gave before losing contact with the woman he loved. The woman who left without warning, who vanished without a trace, and who took with her the son he had longed to raise. The boy at the park was 10 years old. Exactly the amount of time that had passed since that loss. The same features, the same age, the same passion for painting. The coincidence was too great to be just coincidence. The next morning, Thomas woke up early. He arrived at the park before his usual time, set up the easel, laid out the paints. But he didn't start painting. He simply waited. Anxious, nervous, hopeful. And then, the boy appeared, sketchbook under his arm, smile on his face. But this time, he carried something different in his hands. A photograph. The sky was overcast that morning, but Thomas arrived at the park earlier than usual. Anxiety churned inside him, even though his face remained composed and quiet. He set up the easel slowly, but didn't even stretch the canvas. He didn't want to paint. He couldn't. His mind was trapped by one image, the old painting the boy had said was hanging in his home. It was impossible to ignore. Every phrase the boy had said echoed like a premonition. A painting with a hard-to-read signature, a mother who once knew the artist. The same age, the features, the spontaneity. Everything pointed toward a possibility Thomas couldn't bring himself to accept. Yet it pulsed within him. When he saw the boy approaching, his chest tightened. He carried the same sketchbook as always, but something in his expression had changed. There was a sparkle in his eyes, a fresh excitement. In his hands, he held a cell phone. As he reached Thomas, he offered the phone like someone revealing a precious secret. "I took the photo last night. This is the painting." Thomas took the phone. The screen displayed a clear image. He recognized it immediately. One of the first paintings he had ever made over a decade ago. A one-of-a-kind piece, created during a quiet, sleepless night, back when he still lived with the woman who left. He remembered it precisely. A field at sunset, with orange tones and quick brushstrokes. And in the lower right corner, in small but legible letters, the signature he used at the time. T.A. But what made his breath hitch was the faint detail on the back of the canvas, visible in the photo. He had written it in thin pen. "For my little artist. With love, Daddy." Thomas felt the world tilt for a moment. Silence surrounded them. The boy, unaware of the storm inside the painter, simply smiled. "Beautiful, right? My mom always said it was a special painting. She never let anyone take it down. She didn't talk about it much, just said it came from a hard time in her life." Thomas swallowed hard. His whole body trembled, though he tried to hold himself together. And she never said who the artist was. Just that he was someone important, someone she knew before we moved here. The boy sat down beside him, as he always did. He picked up a brush, dipped it in paint, and began to color a blank page. Thomas watched him as if witnessing a miracle. That signature was his. That dedication. He remembered writing it just before wrapping the painting and hiding it behind the couch. Back then, he still believed he'd watch his son grow up, that there'd be time, that life would allow him to build a family on art, love, and presence. But everything had fallen apart so quickly. The woman he had lived with had suddenly said she couldn't do it anymore, that she needed space. And then she left. At the time, the boy was 2 years old. He used to crawl across the rug in the morning holding empty paint jars and laughing at the sight of his dad painting. After that, silence. No letters, no calls, no trace. And now, here he was, 8 years later, with a smile nearly identical to his own, with similar mannerisms, with the same sparkle in his eyes when holding a brush. Thomas could barely speak. "That painting," he said, his voice hoarse. "Do you like it?" "A lot. I always wondered who the daddy in the message was. I thought maybe it was the grandfather I never met. But I never really knew. My mom always changed the subject." Thomas closed his eyes for a moment. He needed to think, to understand. He couldn't just give in to the feeling, but everything inside him was screaming. "Can I ask you something?" he said, slowly opening his eyes. "Sure," the boy replied, still focused on his painting. "Your mom, what's she like?" The boy smiled. "Oh, she's strict, but nice. She works a lot. Sometimes she gets sad out of nowhere. But when I draw, She always says I got that from someone very special. Thomas couldn't hold back his emotions anymore. It was as if every word the boy spoke fit perfectly into the puzzle of his past. And have you lived here long? A few years, I think. Before this, we lived in another city. But she doesn't talk much about it. She says it brings back bad memories. Thomas nodded in silence. He felt the world rearranging itself around him. The boy showed the painting he was working on. A landscape, field, sun, trees, bright colors. Thomas instantly recognized it. It was the same composition as the painting he had made years ago. The same framing. "You have talent," he said, trying to smile. "You think so?" "I'm sure of it." That night, Thomas went home feeling like he had walked through a tunnel of memories. He didn't sleep. He spent hours looking through old photos, digging up old sketches, trying to recall every detail of the woman who left. He needed to see her. He needed to silence the doubt in his heart. Deep down, he already knew. The night dragged on, weighed down by thoughts that refused to rest. Thomas tried to distract himself. He grabbed a fresh canvas, prepared his paints, but couldn't lay down a single stroke. The portrait he needed to paint wouldn't fit on any canvas. It lived entirely in his mind, fragmented, confusing, but real. The image of the painting still pulsed behind his eyes. That signature, that dedication, and the boy who had appeared out of nowhere with such familiar features, the exact age. It was too much coincidence to ignore. And now, after all these years, Thomas felt he was one step away from the truth. The next morning, he arrived at the park earlier than usual. The boy showed up minutes later, more cheerful than ever. "My mom's picking me up today. She wants me to meet her at the park entrance." Thomas felt his body stiffen. "Has she been here before?" "Never, but she's stopping by real quick. She said she has an appointment nearby." This was the moment. His heart raced. He tried to stay calm. "That's great. That way I can thank her for letting you come here so often." The boy nodded and sat down to paint again. But Thomas could barely focus. Every minute, he glanced at the park entrance, waiting for her to appear. Time stretched out as if the universe were forcing him to feel every second of that wait. And then, she appeared. She was walking briskly, just like she always used to. Brown hair tied back in a simple bun, modest clothes, phone in hand. She wasn't much different than he remembered. Maybe a bit thinner, with tired lines on her face. But it was her. Thomas froze. He stood completely still, as if his body refused to process what his eyes already knew. She didn't see him right away. She called for the boy, who ran to her with a wide smile. "Mom, he taught me how to paint this," he said, holding up the page. She looked at the drawing with tenderness, but when her eyes rose, she stopped. Her steps froze. Her gaze met Thomas's, and in that instant, time seemed to collapse between them. There was shock. There was fear. There was everything. Thomas said nothing. Neither did she. They just looked at each other, her eyes filled with tears. His had been ready for a long time. "Thomas," she murmured, her voice cracking. He nodded silently. You're here?" "I never left," he answered softly, his voice restrained but heavy with pain. She lowered her eyes, gently took the boy's hand. "We have to go." Thomas took a step forward. "He's my son, isn't he?" She hesitated. I thought you didn't want to know anymore. You were so absorbed in your world. The painting, the studio. I was afraid. So I left. You took him from me, and never said a word. 8 years. The boy, still confused, looked back and forth between them, not understanding what was happening. "Mom, who is he?" She crouched down, cupped the boy's face in her hands, and whispered something Thomas couldn't hear. The boy's expression shifted. He looked back at Thomas, eyes wide. She stood up, lowered her gaze once more. I didn't do the right thing, and I know you'll never forgive me. But I raised him the best I could. He's good. He's pure. Just like you were, when you painted from the heart. Thomas took a deep breath. He wanted to scream. He wanted to hug the boy. He wanted to cry and ask why. But all he could say was, "He's all I have left." She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I need to go now, but if you want, we can talk later. Properly." She handed him a piece of paper with a phone number. Thomas took it silently and watched them walk away. He stood there for minutes, frozen. The boy looked back twice as if he wanted to return, but he didn't. That night, Thomas walked to the old studio he hadn't opened in years. He unlocked the door with effort. The smell of dried paint and damp wood filled the air. He turned on the lights, uncovered the canvases, and placed a blank sheet on the center easel. It was time to begin again. The next day began heavy with low clouds covering the city sky. Thomas hadn't slept at all. The number on the slip of paper still sat there, on the studio table. He hadn't called. He wasn't sure if it was the right time, or if there was anything left to say that hadn't already been written in the boy's eyes the day before. He only knew one thing. He needed to see him again. He returned to the park earlier than usual, set up his easel, placed a blank canvas, and sat down. The brush rested beside him untouched, but he didn't paint. He just waited. And then, Ethan appeared. The boy walked with lighter steps than usual, but there was hesitation in his eyes, the kind that comes from trying to understand something far bigger than a 10-year-old can fully grasp. "Hi, Dad?" Thomas felt his entire body tremble at those words. For the first time, he heard them spoken with full awareness. No fear, no confusion. "Hi, son," he replied, voice tight with emotion. Ethan sat beside him, didn't say anything for a moment. He simply pulled his sketchbook from his backpack and opened it in silence. "I didn't know," he murmured, eyes still on the page. "When she told me, yesterday, I wanted to ask a million things. But she was crying, and I just stayed quiet." Thomas moved a little closer. "I didn't know where you were either. All these years I tried to imagine. I thought of you every time I saw kids running in the park. I wondered if you still liked to draw. If maybe, somehow, you still remembered me, even just a little." Ethan kept drawing, focused. The pencil moved steadily across the paper. "She told me you used to paint beautiful things, and that you gave me a painting when I was a baby. That's the one in the living room, right?" Thomas nodded. "I painted it during a night when you were sleeping in my arms. I wanted to capture that moment and leave something behind, in case life pulled us apart." Ethan paused his drawing. "I felt something the first time I saw you in the park, you know? Before I knew who you were. It felt safe. Like I already knew you." Thomas smiled, eyes brimming with tears. "Maybe that's because we never really stopped recognizing each other. Even without knowing why." The boy looked at him for a moment. "Do you really want to teach me to paint?" "More than anything." Ethan returned to his drawing, now with a small smile on his lips. When he finished, he showed it to his father. It was a simple but powerful image. Two people sitting under a tree sharing a canvas. One older, one younger, and a golden light between them. "That's us, right?" he asked. "That's us," Thomas replied, voice firm but full of emotion. "Can I bring my paints tomorrow? I want to paint with you for real. Bring everything, and come anytime you want." Ethan nodded. He carefully tucked the sketchbook away. Before leaving, he stepped in front of Thomas and hugged him. Quick, almost shy, but with all the strength a 10-year-old could put into one gesture. "Bye, Dad. See you tomorrow, son." And as the boy walked away, Thomas turned to the blank canvas in front of him. He picked up the brush for the first time that day, and with a steady hand, made the first stroke of a brand new story. Little by little, their meetings in the park stopped feeling coincidental. Thomas and Ethan no longer needed excuses. It was there, in that space between canvases, paint, and old trees, that the two of them found a way to understand what it meant to be together again after so much time. Every morning, the boy arrived with a backpack full of notebooks, brushes, and smiles. Thomas would be waiting with fresh canvases and a spot reserved beside him, as if there had always been space for Ethan there. "Today I want to paint a rainy landscape," Ethan said one day. "But not a sad kind of rain, one that feels like it's washing everything clean." Thomas nodded. The boy had no idea just how much that made sense. In the early days, Ethan's mother would only drop him off at the park entrance. She watched from afar, never coming closer. There was guilt in her eyes, but also a quiet curiosity, as if she were trying to see how far this bond could grow without her interference. Thomas glimpsed her occasionally. He didn't try to push for contact. He respected her timing. He respected the pain. Ethan, on the other hand, spoke freely. "She's still confused, but I told her painting with you makes me feel good, that I like being here." And what did she say? She cried, then smiled. That morning, Ethan brought a wooden box he had decorated himself with finger paints. Inside, he kept his favorite colors and a little notebook where he wrote ideas for paintings. Thomas thought it was wonderful. "Can I leave this box with you? That way it stays here in the park. It's kind of like our studio now." "Of course, and I'll keep it safe." The boy smiled, satisfied. They painted for hours. Thomas started guiding him with more technique. Light, shadow, depth, but always gently. He didn't want it to become a burden. It was more about expression than perfection. "What if one day we had our own exhibition?" Ethan asked, excited. "With our paintings side by side." "I think that's a great idea. We could choose a theme. How about reunions?" Ethan loved it. He wrote the title in his notebook, Surrounded by Stars. That afternoon, as they said goodbye, Thomas handed the boy a small case of new paintbrushes. "These are yours. Same kind I used when I started." "Thank you, Dad." The word came more naturally now, more filled with affection and belonging. Across the park, Ethan's mother watched, this time not with distance alone, but with a gentle wave. Thomas returned the gesture respectfully. There was no rush, no demands, just the quiet understanding that something was being rebuilt. Ethan ran off, as he always did, clutching the brush case like it was treasure. Thomas remained once again, facing the canvas in front of him. He began to paint. This time, the scene wasn't imagined. It was real. Their meetings in the park were no longer just moments of painting. They had become quiet rituals of affection, connection, and healing. Ethan arrived each morning with new ideas, and Thomas was continually amazed by the sensitivity the boy poured into every stroke. "I think we should paint together today," Ethan said one overcast morning. "Just one canvas, the two of us." Thomas smiled. "I like that idea. Got an image in mind?" "Yeah, a bridge, because that's what we built, and that's what they did." They placed the largest canvas on the center easel, mixed their paints, and began. Their brushstrokes crossed, overlapped, completed each other. In just a few hours, the bridge took shape. Simple, colorful, but full of meaning. A bridge between two worlds, between what was lost and what was found again. Later that afternoon, with the painting still drying, Ethan turned to Thomas. "What if this was the first piece in our exhibition?" "I think that's perfect." In the days that followed, they gathered the rest of the paintings. Some were Ethan's, others Thomas's, and a few they had created together. They chose as the theme of the exhibit the very word that had brought them together: reunions. With the help of a small neighborhood cultural center, they secured a room to showcase the artwork for 1 week. The space was modest but warm. White walls, soft lighting, and the smell of fresh paint in the air. On setup day, as they arranged the paintings on the walls, Ethan's mother appeared. She stood quietly at a distance, watching. In her hands, a bag with bottles of water and snacks wrapped in foil. "I brought you something to eat," she said, a little awkward. Thomas welcomed her with a respectful smile. "Thank you. We're just about finished." She walked toward one of the walls and stopped in front of the bridge painting. "Was it his idea?" she asked. "Yes. And he painted half of it himself." She lightly touched the frame as if touching a piece of the sun she didn't fully know. "He's good," she said. "Really good? He's incredible." Silence. "Do you still hold resentment toward me?" Thomas paused for a few seconds. "I did, for a long time, but now, no. I think I'm just holding on to what we can still build. Me, him, you, if you'd like." She took a deep breath. Her eyes filled with tears, but she stayed composed. "Thank you for not giving up on him, even when I ran away. I ran too, in other ways, but I think now, we're all finding our way back." On opening night, dozens of people passed through the exhibit. Friends, neighbors, Ethan's school teachers. Each person paused thoughtfully at the paintings. Many remarked on the harmony between the boys and the man's work, as if they spoke the same language, just in different tones. Ethan moved from one painting to the next, explaining the stories behind each one with excitement. "I painted this one, but this line right here, that was my dad." When Thomas heard that, he closed his eyes for a moment. Not because he doubted it, but because finally, he believed it. At the end of the day, the three of them, Thomas, Ethan, and his mother, sat on a bench outside the cultural center. The late afternoon light cast a golden glow across the sky, and the noise of the city felt far away. "He's happy," she said. "And so am I," Thomas replied. "That's new for all three of us." "Yeah, but it feels right." Ethan, lying with his head on his mother's lap and his feet resting on Thomas's legs, closed his eyes with a smile on his face. And in that silence, they all understood something. When reunions are real, they don't need explanations, only presence. The last day of the exhibit had arrived. The gallery, once bustling with visitors, now carried the quiet feeling of farewell. Some of the walls were already bare, marked by where paintings had been removed. Others still held the final pieces, waiting for their next destination. Among them, the bridge painting, the first one they created together, remained steady at the center of the gallery. It had been the most photographed, the most talked about, not because of its technique, but because of the story behind it. A story of reunion, of rediscovered bonds, of ties that held firm, even through the silence of time. Thomas and Ethan had been there since morning, organizing everything. The boy, as cheerful as ever, scribbled ideas for new paintings into a fresh notebook his father had given him. "We could paint the seasons," he suggested. "One for each stage we lived apart, and one for now." "I like that," Thomas replied, "and we'll paint them together." Ethan's mother arrived in the late afternoon. This time she didn't just watch, she joined in. She helped pack the paintings, rolled up the posters, and laid out snacks for the end of the day. "Can I ask you something?" she said, folding a protective cloth. Thomas nodded. "Do you think there's still time for me to reconnect with him too?" Thomas smiled gently. "He never left you. He was just waiting." She looked at her son, who at that moment was laughing softly while studying an old drawing. "He's so much stronger than I ever was. Maybe because he has a little of both of us," Thomas said. At the end of the day, they brought the paintings back to the studio. A space that had once felt lonely was now full of life. Filled with color, worn brushes, and footprints, some small, others larger. Ethan organized the brushes at the work table. Thomas prepared a new canvas, clean, untouched. "Dad," the boy said, walking over, "can we paint something now?" "Now?" "Yeah," to be the first of many, the first of our next exhibit. Thomas looked at the canvas, smiled. Then you paint the first stroke. Ethan picked up a brush, dipped it in light blue, and drew a soft line in the upper left corner. I started. Thomas picked up another brush and painted the second line right beside his son's. And I continued. They stayed there side by side, painting slowly. The canvas was still mostly blank, but it held more story than many walls ever could. In the back of the studio, Ethan's mother watched them. There was no longer guilt in her eyes, only peace, and the kind that comes from knowing that what truly matters and is still here. And so, between paint and silence, father and son began a new canvas. No drafts, no fear, just everything that truly matters. Presence. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and share it with someone who believes in the power of reunions and the bond between parents and children. Do you know a story where life brought back together those who should have never been apart? Tell us in the comments. We'll see you in the next video. And remember, some ties may loosen with time, but the real ones are never truly broken.